Good morning, everybody. This is the moderator. My name is Nate Green. I'm just getting everything started here. We'll hang out for a couple minutes and we'll do introductions and get things going in just a few minutes. Good morning, everybody. I turned on my video, but it's not necessary that you need to. We'll get going in just a minute here. So I just wanted to break the ice because I always think it's kind of strange when we have Zoom meetings and everybody's just silent. And I feel like we need like some background music or like movie trailers should be playing or something just to fill the silence for a little bit. But we got a couple minutes. It's nice to see a lot of people are popping in now, which is lovely. So how is everybody?
Doing well.
Doing well? Good. Good. Lovely. What do we have? 8 people so far. Very good. We're getting close. So we'll officially start right at 9 with a little introductions and get things going before we dive into the presentation. I'm really excited about them. And I'll tell you why when I like officially introduce myself at 9, which feels kind of weird that I'm not doing it now, but what can I do? So, but I also thought, like, and I really appreciate so many people are turning on their cameras. You don't have to by any means. I turned mine on also because I sort of figured, I know when I'm talking and like presenting through Zoom, it's really helpful to have another face to see like, oh, there's a person there. I'm not just like talking to myself. But I understand if you want to turn my face off also. Okay, well, I guess, I mean, it is officially 9, so why don't we just get started? So let me introduce myself. My name is Nate Green. I am the Director of Honors, one of the Directors of Honors at Russell Sage College in Albany and Troy. Our topic today is readerly and writerly change. We have 4 presenters today. And as always, like the professor at the beginning of every single class, please forgive me if I mispronounce anybody's names. We have 4 presenters today. We have Gabrielle Filippini from Fairleigh Dickinson University, and whose work is titled, "It Was the Worst of Times, A Century of Literary Dystopias." We also have Elizabeth Busch from Mount St. Mary's University with the title "Me Too, Junot, Diaz, and the Lord of the Rings, Authorial Responsibility and the Ethics of Readership." Ashley Alvarado from SUNY Old Westbury, presenting on "A Growing Glass, a Philosophical and Legal Account of the Modern American Woman." And Trisha Mehta from Ramapo College of New Jersey, presenting "The Monster That Is Man, a Feminist View of William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing and A Midsummer Night's Dream." So I am particularly excited about these because every single one of those titles is something that I, as a writing professor, am really interested in, like Lord of the Rings, Junot, Diaz, Dystopias, Shakespeare, like all of those things I'm really excited to hear about. So here's what we're going to do in our session. We have an hour and 15 minutes total. So I believe each presenter is prepared for about 10 to 15 minutes of presentation, give or take. So what we'll do is I will time for 15 minutes. Each presenter will have 15 minutes total. If you don't use the full time, that's fine. At the end of each presentation, we'll have 2 or 3 minutes for questions. And then at the end of the session, we'll have questions for everybody. So if you don't get to ask your questions of the particular presenter directly after their presentation, we'll have some time at the end to follow up with more questions for everybody, which I always think is interesting because then sometimes we get like comparison questions like, oh, you said this in yours and you said this in yours, and that's interesting. So I will keep track and I'll keep time, just because we need to move along and make sure we have time for questions and everybody has time to do their presentations. So what I will do for that is remind the presenters when you're getting close. I'll give you a little 2-minute warning. So at 13 minutes, I will message you privately and just say 2 more minutes, please wrap it up. And then when we hit 15 minutes, I will have to gently, I hope, interrupt and say, okay, we really need to wrap up now just to move on. If you don't need it, that's fine, but just so you know that that's how we're going to progress. I will ask everybody else to please mute while we're having our presentations. If you have questions, you can message in the chat. You can privately message me in the chat, or please raise your hand once we get to the question time. So Okay, like that was a lot of maintaining things. Does anybody have any questions before we get going? Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the list the way it's listed in NRHC's presentation information. So first, we have Gabrielle Filippini. When you're ready to go, on you go. Sorry, I'm like, no, you can go. Does anybody need screen sharing? I don't know whether you are, if anybody's sharing.
I'd like to screen share slides, if that's possible.
No problem. Give me just a second here while I get you set up for that.
Excuse me, I have a question if you don't mind. I'm also doing is this for the roundtable as well, presentations? Or am I early?
So this particular Zoom meeting is just presentations for 4 presenters. The roundtables, I believe I would have to double check the times for those, but I think they're at a later time.
Oh, okay. Is it okay if I stay though and see the presentation?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sure.
Gabrielle, I think you're ready.
Find the right tab. Can you see the Google Slides tab, or is it still on NRHC? We're good? Okay.
Google Slides, we're good.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm glad to start us off with something nice and cheerful. My research is entitled, It Was the Worst of Times, A Century of Literary Dystopias. I chose this topic not because I was interested in dystopias growing up. In fact, I kind of avoided them because when I was in high school, I thought it was so cool by not reading the same things that everybody else was reading. But I actually re-encountered dystopian literature in college in a young adult literature course taught by my honors director, Dr. Patrick. And in that course, I started to think about it as a future teacher because I'm student teaching now as a grad student and I'm going to be a high school English teacher. And I thought about these texts in terms of, okay, here's what we teach our students, here's what our students are reading, but how do these texts affect them as they're growing up? A study of the dystopian genre as a whole over a century's worth of time, and these 10 books were my representative sample, consisting of We, published in 1924, Brave New World, published 1932, 1984, published 1949, Fahrenheit 451, published 1953, Atlas Shrugged, published 1957, The Handmaid's Tale, published 1985, The Giver, published 1993, The Hunger Games, published 2008, and Legend and Ready Player One, both published in 2011. And in looking at these texts, which represent a century's worth of time and a century's worth of this tradition, it brought me to my first research question. What makes a dystopia? What do a century's worth of evolving texts all have in common? If someone were with no knowledge of utopias or dystopias was to pick up Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, which is recognized as the first dystopia, and Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games, which is arguably one of the most popular, would they know they were the same genre, and how? And before I discuss how they are the same, I'm first going to discuss how they're different. Looking at my 10 sample texts, we can identify 2 distinct traditions of writing on their timeline, split kind of exactly in the middle. This distinction is based on work by scholar David Ketterer in his 1989 article about The Handmaid's Tale. Novels in my study that were published between 1920 and 1960 all fit a mold that some scholars would call the anti-utopian tradition of dystopian writing. All 5 of these novels have very similar construction, including that the societies in them are based on traditional utopian ideals. So the societies present as perfect, but then we're shown that they are twisted and they're not as perfect as they seem to be. The societies are also modeled usually after existing systems. So types of communism, types of capitalism, often totalitarianism, but taken to an extreme. The protagonists of all these novels are your average Joe or average Jane citizen, where they're not outstanding, they're typically middle class, usually white given the time period and the publication locations. And there's nothing really striking about them. but they come to an awakening that there's more to life or there's something wrong through some kind of romance or romantic interest, while the rest of the citizens in the novel tend to be complacent. Usually our protagonists become special because they recognize that something's wrong while everybody else is kind of believing that things are still perfect. And the other thing that kind of sets these novels apart from later novels is that they tend to have really dreary endings in a lot of cases. Our protagonists are generally unsuccessful, sometimes very unsuccessful, and horrible things happen to them, or they're just sent away and it becomes apparent that there was no hope that they could change anything, that they were too small to take down a regime so large. And that's our first half, or our first tradition. Second half. So beginning with The Handmaid's Tale, the 5 later novels in my study that were published between 1980 and 2011 are drastically different than the books that came before them, but they're all similar to each other in the same way that those prior books were. And the biggest way is that they're not based on utopian societies per se. It's not a typical utopia that's going on in their book. Normally they have something that's very specific about them that sets their society apart. And that's where we get this word context or contextual. There's a specific context to these societies. So for example, in The Handmaid's Tale, at the time of publication, there was a lot of worry about religious zeal and about nuclear fallout. And so in The Handmaid's Tale, we get a theocracy where women are controlled because only some are fertile because of the nuclear radiation. In Legend, we get a dystopia where all of the conflict and the totalitarianism is because the continents are shrinking due to climate change related sea level rise. And then the striations in society are based on deterministic standardized testing that puts you in a specific caste of society. And so we get these very specific contexts in these later books. We also get more varying protagonists of different ages, as well as genders, and generally a very aware populace. Where in the anti-utopian books, the protagonists were special because they were the only ones that realized what was going on. Most of the general kind of run-of-the-mill population in these newer books knows that they're kind of living in a hellish society, but they're kind of powerless to do anything about it. And our protagonists become special not because they're the only ones who realize it, but because they're the only ones who achieve success. These books are written for varying audiences. So as we know, more contemporary dystopias tend to be marketed towards teens and preteens, whereas the older dystopias were marketed towards adults. And these books also are all similar in that they usually have some kind of happy or successful ending. And even if the ending is ambiguous, there's still a presence of hope, whereas the other dystopias in the anti-utopian tradition tend to be very hopeless. So once it was clear that these texts were different, I sought out how to determine the ways in which they were the same. Which brings me to the part of my research where the English teacher starts talking about a whole lot of math. With a sample size as large as 10 novels, pouring through each and every one individually with traditional close reading techniques was kind of an insurmountable task. So while I read my 10 sample texts, my computer read them as well. Using distant reading methods pioneered by literary scholar Franco Moretti, I was able to produce analysis of the books that looked like this. The graph that you're looking at right now was produced by a machine reading tool called Voyant, and it is graphing the relative frequencies of the most popular words across these 5 novels. So the reason we picked these words as significant is because they were the most used words in all the texts that were not character names or stop words, words like said or like or the or any other article. And they were the first nouns or action verbs of significance. So in our anti-utopian novels, these words are man, face, and time. Upon further research and closer inspection, it became apparent that man and face, these popular words, were kind of synonymous with the theme of identity and individualism in these anti-utopian texts. And time we're going to revisit later. Also graph this for the contextual dystopias. We have the same exact graph using the same exact methods. And in these novels, the most popular words were time again, as well as think and eyes. Time we'll revisit. Upon closer inspection of think, it became apparent that it matches up with the theme of having power over your government through information and knowledge. And the word eyes was also matching up to the theme of normative surveillance, or being watched constantly. In looking for the similarities between all of these texts, here was my answer. So this graph just shows the most popular word amongst all 10 of these novels, and it is time. Time was the 4th most popular words in all of the texts, and it was only preceded by stop words such as said and like. It's also the only term that's significant across both halves of the genre. It tended to be that if you had a word that was more popular with anti-utopias, it would not appear at all in contextual dystopias, and vice versa. But time appeared across every single text. And of course, words can be used in a variety of ways. So I did a lot of experiments and I analyzed a lot of data points to determine whether or not time was actually significant. And I'd be happy to expand on that in Q&A later, specifically how those experiments did and how I came to that conclusion. But through all of that experimentation, I learned that it is in fact significant to the dystopian themes of the novels. Time relates to 3 major dystopian themes, one past, one present, and one future. I'm going to explain these themes using 1984, The Handmaid's Tale, and The Hunger Games as representatives of all of my sample. First of the dystopian themes of time deals with the past, and that is an extrapolated apocalypse. So in these dystopian societies, they happen or they come about as a result of some kind of calamity or large-scale collapse of the world as it was before the dystopia. But typically they aren't explained in explicit detail because the reader is supposed to assume that what is happening in their present outside of the book is what's going to lead to this future collapse. So if you are a reader that's contemporary to the novel, you're reading it just when it is published, and you are part of the ideal audience that the author had in mind, you're going to get hints about what caused this collapse or this apocalypse, and your own social, economic, and political anxieties are going to fill in the gaps. It deals with the present, and that is normative surveillance. So the present of these regimes, these totalitarian states, maintain their power through invasive and sometimes all-encompassing surveillance that's backed up by the threat of violence and by the threat of punishment. George Orwell's 1984 made very popular the motif of technological surveillance. So cameras and microphones, speakers, screens that watch you, loudspeakers as well as secret police. And so everyone knows in 1984, Big Brother is watching you, but also you have the thought police, which are similar to in The Handmaid's Tale, you have the eyes, the secret police that hide amongst you and try to root out dissension. And in The Hunger Games, people are watched again by a police force called the Peacekeepers, who aren't very peaceful, as well as drone flyovers. And the games themselves are televised to the entire nation. And so that's another level of being watched. The last theme of time deals with the future, and that's the theme of archival construction. Dystopias tend to practice some form of historical erasure. They don't want people to know the past. They don't want people to know that there was another way or another life, or to understand the whole truth. And so often dystopian protagonists are constructing their own history for the future, explicitly or implicitly. In 1984, Winston is keeping a diary saying, this is going to be for people who come after me. The Handmaid's Tale's narrative itself is Offred's diary. And you can tell in the prologue and in the epilogue, the kind of bookends of her context, they reveal that it is a set of cassette tapes on which she recorded her narrative. And in The Hunger Games, even though Katniss isn't writing, she rewrites history actively in The Hunger Games by surviving it with a partner. Whereas normally, the entire history of those games over 74 years, there's only been a lone victor. To my second research question, I wondered how teenagers that were reading dystopian novels for school and then reading them for fun were affected by them. These novels serve as warnings and calls to action. So what do they do? And to that end, I give you math. Didn't know if you thought you'd be doing this much math this morning. This figure I did not make myself. It comes from American National Election Studies, and it displays the majority political leanings of 5 generations in each election year since exit polling began in 1972. It's cited by political scientist Dr. Patrick Fisher in 2018 in one of many articles about the generation gap between millennials and the generation that came before them. So in looking at this graph, the exact percentages of liberal to conservative don't really matter. What's the most significant about these data points is the fact that the millennial generation, who's all the way down here in purple, is so far apart from Gen X, the generation that precedes them. The gap of white space is double the size if you do the math with each data point between Generation X and the generation that preceded them, which is baby boomers. And this has not happened in any exit polling since 1972. This is the first time a gap of this size has ever existed. And here's more information and more facts about that as well, and specifically how millennials are self-identifying. But in reading this political data, it became apparent that they don't know why this is happening. There's a lot of research being done on this, but in all the proposed answers, they haven't exactly found anything that definitively explains why this large gap has opened. Sorry, lost my place. It just so happens to be, though, that there's a correlation between the popularity of dystopian fiction in the late 2000s and early 2010s and the political coming of age of the millennial generation. So as the millennials were teenagers who were then going to be voting for the first time, they were reading dystopian novels. It is plausible that this correlation might have something to do with the generation gap for a handful of reasons. Firstly, these books model movements and protests positively. They show teenagers and other protagonists taking part in movements and winning. They also highlight the importance of individuals' actions to creating social change. In this quote from sociologist Carl Mannheim, he explains that social change comes about not just because of what it is you're trying to change, but how fast it's changing. And if you remember, when dystopian novels were coming out along with their movies, the market was flooded with this type of literature and with this type of imagery. So nobody can say that the tempo of when dystopian novels were coming about wasn't just as quick as the tempo of change. Now, even though these things are plausible, dystopian fiction could be part of the solution to this unanswered question, but there's no empirical data that proves that what you read growing up affects how you view the world as an adult, because no one's looking for it. There is a prevailing thought that you cannot research the humanities or the humanities' effect on populations in a way that's objective or quantitative. And if I've managed to prove anything to you today by putting way too many numbers in front of your face for a literature presentation at 9 in the morning, it's that you can, and we should. So did popular dystopian fiction contribute to the millennial generation gap in political ideology? I hope one day to attend a conference like this one, where somebody has an empirical, objective answer to that question. Anyone has any questions? Thank you.
Nice job indeed. I think I have one quick question if nobody else has anything to jump in at the moment. Can you tell me just a little bit about the machine reading tool that you use? What was that called and how does that work?
So it's called Voyant, and you can access it I believe it's voyant.com is the URL. And what you do is you take a digitized copy of any text. It doesn't necessarily have to be a book. And I've found that it does work with both Word files and PDF files, although Word is sometimes better because the words don't get jumbled in the way that they do in a PDF. You submit it to Voyant, and Voyant machine reads it. And then it provides you with a variety of different tools where it gives you a data analysis of specifically the words in the book, where they're counting and they're doing math and they're taking averages and they're taking density percentages. And it can tell you things like I showed with how often a particular word is used, and you can filter out specific words. So if you know that the character name or the name of the protagonist is coming up too much, you can remove them so that it doesn't affect your data. You can look at the average density of a sentence. How many words are being used in a sentence? How many individual vocabulary words were used in the book? How unique are the vocabulary words? It'll show you in context. Okay, if this word is being used very often, here are the phrases in which it most appears. And you can really look at books from this wide back spectrum that kind of a human brain is almost not capable of doing unless you yourself are a supercomputer. And it can, if you're using it for multiple texts, reveal a level of similarity that you may not have been able to even pick up on just as a reader.
Interesting. Thank you. And thank you, April Patrick put in a link here for it. And one more quick question before we move on to our next presenter. Matthew McDonald asks, what is your major/area of study? How did you become interested in this topic?
So my major for my bachelor's was literature, concentration Anglo-American literature. And that's why I was interested in the topic. I am also a graduate student in education. I'll be getting a master's of teaching, and I will hopefully by June have a teaching license. I also happen to have a minor in physics, which tends to surprise a lot of people, and I get the big eyeball look. And I have a very strong appreciation for math and science and for interdisciplinary studies in education, which is why I really enjoyed doing a larger study using distant reading as opposed to just my traditional close reading skills that I have as a literature major.
Excellent. Interesting. Thank you very much. Nicely done. Okay, so we'll move on to our next presenter, and Elizabeth Busch is the next on our list. So Elizabeth, when you're ready, would you also like screen sharing capabilities?
Yes, I would, if that's possible.
Okay, no problem. Hold on just one second. Okay, you should be ready to go.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Busch, and I'm a junior at Mount St. Mary's University. And today we're going to be looking at the relationship between the #MeToo movement, the author Junot Diaz, and the Lord of the Rings to see what they can tell us about authorial abuse and the ethics of readership. So, what does it mean for schools or classrooms when authors on their syllabi are accused of or found guilty of misconduct? Usually, this means nothing. Usually, allegations are ignored because all that matters is the text itself and not what's going on in the world around. However, that's no longer an adequate response in the modern world, as knowledge of authors' personal lives is increasingly available. So we're going to use the case study of Junot Diaz to look at the allegations he's currently facing, the aftermath of those allegations, the precedent he sets in his own writing, and the way that those topics combine to give us a path forward. In 2007, Junot Diaz published The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which is a novel about a Dominican-American nerd named Oscar and his family history. Diaz won the Pulitzer Prize for this novel in 2008, and throughout the next decade he was very involved in the literary community. He's currently a professor of creative writing at MIT, he's on the Pulitzer board, and he's a fiction editor for the Boston Review. In October 2017, #MeToo started trending on Twitter as people started sharing their experiences of sexual assault and sexual harassment. Just a few months later, on April 9th, 2018, Diaz published an article titled The Silence in the New Yorker. In this article, he shared the heartbreaking story of his rape as a child and how that rape affected his relationships as an adult. The rest of this presentation does nothing to discredit what he says in that article, but we are going to look at the allegations he's currently facing, apart from his experiences as a child. On May 4th, 2018, the author Zinzi Clemens used a question and answer session at a festival to ask him about this article and whether it was meant to preempt accusations of misconduct against him in the Me Too era. She asked him about how his experiences as a child had shaped his focus, and if they were true, why he had forcibly kissed her at a graduate festival. After this allegation, many other authors spoke up, including Carmen Machado and Monica Byrne, sharing similar stories of verbal harassment. What is the response to these allegations, none of which have been recanted? Diaz provided the following statement to the New York Times. Quote, "I take responsibility for my past. That is the reason I made the decision to tell the truth of my rape and its damaging aftermath. This conversation is important and must continue. I am listening to and learning from women's stories in this essential and overdue cultural movement. We must continue to teach all men about consent and boundaries." End quote. This statement is vague enough to seem like an apology, but it actually doesn't contain any substance. He says that he takes responsibility for his actions, but not once does he mention the women who have accused him, and nor does he apologize for his actions. With his closing sentence, "We must continue to teach all men about consent and boundaries," he lumps himself in with the we who already understand these topics. Despite the lack of substance in this apology, it was enough for the wider academic world. He retains his positions with the Pulitzer Board and with MIT. The Boston Review released the following statement after allowing him to return to his post as an editor. Quote, "We do not think that any of the individual actions that have been reported are of the kind that requires us to end the editorial relationship. To be clear, we do not condone the objectionable behavior that they describe. Instead, we asked ourselves whether the conduct they report is of a kind that, given his role in our mission, requires us to end the editorial relationship. We do not think so. The objectionable conduct described in the public reports does not have the kind of severity that animated the Me Too movement." This statement reveals that the Boston Review appears to believe the accusations against Diaz. They don't say that they didn't happen. They just say that they're not serious enough for any action to be taken against Diaz. They also miss the point of the Me Too movement, which was not that if a woman has not been raped, then everything is fine, that we have to hold people in positions of authority to a higher standard when it comes to issues of sexual harassment and sexual assault. In general, though, scholars have followed this model for how they treat the allegations against Diaz. Most authors who include him in their articles either don't mention the allegations or mention him in a footnote and say that they won't enter into the debate about what's going on. One author who does use the allegations against Diaz to deepen her analysis of his work is Tiffany Lothabo King, who devotes one chapter of her 2019 book, The Black Shoals: Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies, to this issue. She argues, quote, "Rather than center his own trauma and pain in his novels, he transfers and projects his experiences of rape and sexual violation onto the bodies of Black and Indigenous women." King argues that Diaz's experiences as a child do show up, but rather than happening to male characters such as Oscar and Junior, they're transferred onto female characters such as Belly and La Inca. Then the women are forced to survive a trauma and pain that mirrors Diaz's. So what do? We have allegations against an author who's very popular both in personal context and in the academic world, who's facing allegations from multiple women who have never recanted their statements. It's helpful to find a way forward by looking at the precedent that Diaz sets in his own writing in The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. The main character, Oscar, is a nerd, there's no other word for him, and his favorite book is The Lord of the Rings. He reads it all the time, and originally he and the narrator Junior used this book as a way to process their life experiences facing racism and rejection in the United States, and as a way to process their family history in the Dominican Republic. For example, they often compare Trujillo, the dictator in the Dominican Republic, to Sauron, the most evil person in The Lord of the Rings. Despite this initial use for it, The Lord of the Rings is ultimately a failure as a life filter. Oscar has a devastating experience rereading this work as an adult. Quote, "He read The Lord of the Rings for what I'm estimating the millionth time, one of his greatest loves and comforts since he'd first discovered it, back when he was 9 and lost and lonely, and his favorite librarian had said, 'Here, try this,' and with one suggestion changed his life. Got through almost the whole trilogy, but then the line, 'and out of Far-Harad black men like half-trolls,' and he had to stop, his head and heart hurting too much." End quote. Oscar has used Lord of the Rings to escape the racism in his life. However, now he realizes that literature has the power to hold the same prejudices and biases that exist in the real world. Authors have a responsibility to acknowledge this power and to use it powerfully, something that Tolkien does not do, and that leads to Oscar's eventual mental deterioration. So, after this After this incident, mentions of the Lord of the Rings drop out of the brief wondrous life of Oscar Wilde. Earlier in the book, Junior mentions that Oscar is writing a book that's like J.R.R. Tolkien meets E.E. Doc Smith. However, after this devastating reread, Junior drops Lord of the Rings from the reference. It's just an E.E. Doc Smith-esque space opera. Junior validates Oscar's decision to sever ties with Tolkien after noticing the language used in his work. Oscar is not obligated to support an author who has failed him, and he's able to take control of his narrative. So, if we take this standard developed in The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, the way forward seems clear. If authors are unwilling to take the responsibility that they have towards literature seriously, and if their prejudices in real life show up in their novels, as they do in The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, then the way forward seems to be to stop reading them, especially in academic contexts. So what do we do for independent readers, for people who just want to read The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde for fun? Reading a novel for fun is much different than teaching it in a classroom, because the only person involved is the person who purchases the book and the author. However, because of the widespread availability of the allegations against Diaz and the fact that he's still alive, people who want to read The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde for fun must be willing to acknowledge that they are financially supporting an author who has unrepentantly abused women in his life. And if that is not a problem for readers, then they're more than welcome to do so. But there cannot be a denial of the actions that Diaz has taken, given how available the information is about it. The situation is very different for schools, though. When schools put a book on its syllabus, they're saying that that book is important, that it conveys important truths about humanity. As a result, we have to hold authors to a higher standard than we have so far, especially because at this point in time, we do not take seriously the atrocities that authors committed in their personal lives. Unless schools are willing to cover the allegations that Diaz is facing and to enter into a real debate about how those allegations affect his work, it is time for this book to go on the shelf for a while. For schools that decide to keep The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde in their curricula, the book list should include a note that students who have an ethical issue with Diaz's actions might want to buy the book secondhand. Some people would argue that doing this could open schools up to a situation in which they have to write a disclaimer for every writer. But I think this measure is only essential for situations such as Diaz, in which the unrepentant mistreatment of women in real life mirrors the narratives in his story. Additionally, including these notes would force teachers and administrators to consider the narratives they privilege, particularly if every writer on student syllabi faces allegations of misconduct. Also, these notes aren't unprecedented in the academic world. Some schools have already begun adding trigger warnings to their book list to help students who are recovering from trauma. If schools refuse to address the issue of writers with histories of misconduct, both professors and students have a duty to speak up. This could involve, as a starting point, introducing the issue in classroom discussions. However, if a book will still not be taught in a manner that acknowledges the writer's actions and their effect on victims and their work, students have to employ more drastic measures such as attempting to change the curriculum. Hopefully, this spectrum of responses will lead to a widespread call for writers to take responsibility for their own stories, as well as the ones they create and share through their writing. If writers no longer receive support from ignorant and careless audiences, they will begin to understand that the era of complacency has passed, and the time has come for them to accept the consequences of their decisions and actions. At first, this course of action may seem too harsh. After all, many of the greatest writers in the literary canon have objectionable personal lives, but we still read and promote their works. In response, many of the writers whose private actions were dubious at best, such as Edgar Allan Poe, have passed away and can no longer profit from their works, unlike Diaz. Also, the reason that these writers enjoy positions in the canon is not because earlier generations of scholars have carefully scrutinized the relationship between their lives and works and decided that their misconduct did not affect their writing. Rather, until now, the academic and private literary sectors have mostly dismissed arguments against such writers as irrelevant. This response becomes untenable in light of the #MeToo movement and other trends in public opinion. As these shifting perspectives indicate, literature is too important to our society's functioning to sustain this stance. The stories that we value communicate our ethics, viewpoints, and our goals to future generations with the hope of both educating and inspiring them. It is time to claim those narratives that help us to achieve that end and to reject those that undo our progress towards fully realizing our human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have a couple minutes. Does anybody have any questions?
So you mentioned in your presentation how in Oscar Wilde, The Lord of the Rings kind of fails its reader as a filter for life. I think it's really unfortunate that a novel such as Oscar Wilde that is about a diverse protagonist is having to be looked at differently because the author has done irresponsible things. Do you think that in reading Oscar Wilde itself, that the novel also fails in its purpose to the readers of being a kind of diverse and uplifting book because of subtle things that might have been included within it because of the author and his actions?
Yes, I do. And I agree that it is unfortunate because the book is incredible and it features perspectives that are not really explored very much in the classroom. But when you read the novel, there are a lot of women have very traumatic experiences. And then when you see those experiences being mirrored by the author in his personal life, it becomes very difficult. It becomes, as you said, a failure.
Thank you.
I have a question, if you don't mind. Comparing the Lord of the Rings book to the movies, do you see like the same similarities or differences? Because not all the information in the books are in the movies. Is that correct? So does that have a change of anything?
Are you asking specifically about racism or about the works as a whole?
Overall.
Well, I think they convey the same messages, even though things were left out and adapted. And the main cast continues to be all white. So I think it conveys a lot of the same messages that Oscar struggled with as he reread the book for the last time. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you so much. And nice job on your presentation.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to our next presentation. Again, we'll have some time at the end for overall questions for everybody. But next we have Ashley Alvarado. Ashley, if you hold on just one second, I will make you a co-host and we should be ready to go. So as soon as you're ready, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to be mostly speaking during this portion. And I wanted to introduce myself again as Ashley Alvarado. I go to SUNY Westbury, and I'm a philosophy major. And what my paper is titled is A Growing Glass. Sorry about that. Philosophical and legal account of the modern American woman. So what does this mean to me, and how did I come up with this paper? That's a big question. And where it started was because I was sitting in class, and I was specifically looking at Supreme Court cases. And I was wondering, what is the foundation of these cases? Yes, we have the legal reasoning that's in them through the judges, but what is kind of creating these ideas? What is influencing the judges and their thoughts? So a part of what this is about is exploring that through the way that philosophy has developed, through ancient philosophies like that of Plato to more modern individuals like Simone de Beauvoir, and seeing how that connects these specific philosophies to landmark Supreme Court cases. So I will start with my first part, which kind of goes through the foundations and the historical notions of gender equality and what those arguments were. So when thinking of ancient philosophies, my first thought was Plato and his work in the Republic, which recounts what Socrates was saying and what he was arguing with numerous individuals and what an ideal society is. So throughout this discussion in the Republic, Socrates speaks to an individual named Glaucon and what he believes is the most ideal society. So among those discussions is the placement of women in this society, in society in general. And what Plato is saying, one of the things that he says is that men and women should receive equal treatment and education because the current state of society does not have the necessary amount of information to claim that men and women should be in specific societal roles. Because the reason Socrates is saying this is because the argument was made about nature and about where someone should be, where women should be specifically by his opponent Glaucon. So Socrates uses a specific example by discussing dogs, oddly enough. He says that in nature, while there's a difference in physical strength, both male and female dogs contribute to hunting and other duties equally. In comparison to humans, if women have the same expectations and duties in society as men, what follows is the same education and nurture. And since men and women are different in nature, this is what his opponent was saying. His opponent was saying, since men and women are different in nature, this provides justification that they should have different functions in society. But Socrates states that the conflict of this statement is contradictory in the sense that many men are forced to be in a position that they may not wish to be in, and that in itself may be against its nature, against their nature. He states that while we do believe in different natures should be within their, and people should be within their specialty, there's never a consideration towards the meaning of difference in nature and how this difference is assigned. Socrates, once again, provides another example of the absurdity in the assignment of these roles by stating, if bald men are cobblers, we should forbid the hairy men to be cobblers, and conversely. And what that means, oddly enough, is that because we have this perception that this person is supposed to be in this position, does that mean that we forbid other people from doing something similar or the same thing? So bringing this back to women specifically, to Socrates, even though women are different in the fact that they can bear children, this alone does not provide the basis for the denial of equal education. Now, I don't want to talk about Socrates and say that he was totally for 100% for women's rights, but this was part of the argument that he made, at least at the minimum, for equal education, for some type of equality in education more specifically, and for some type of equality in treatment. But just to say, Socrates, throughout his works, still portrays women with an overall inferiority to men. But this is ancient philosophy. This is as close as we're getting, especially when you hear about Aristotle. So Aristotle replied to Plato, going against the argument that women should have any form of equality. And he explains that this state of nature is clear. The husband's the father, inherently has control over his wife and children, and the nature of men makes them more suited for positions of power in comparison to females. Aristotle's argument is rooted in the basis of the soul, which is an interesting idea. He came up with this concept of what the soul should be. And he's saying that for the soul, there's two parts of it. There's one that naturally usurps control, it seizes control, and another part that's supposed to be submissive. And an example to kind of explain this, he provides is the relation between the master and the slave, or the male or the female. While souls within the relations have both submissive and usurping aspects within them. So it has both something, the soul has both something that wants to kind of come down, be more submissive, but something that also wants to rise. Those aspects aren't presented, those two different feelings aren't presented to the same degree. In Aristotle's words, the slave has no deliberate faculty at all. The woman has, but it's without authority. With this, a man's valor is determined in their ruling, and a man's valor is determined by the way they rule. And a woman's valor is shown by being silent. And a woman's virtue is therefore relative to the master, which is the man. So definitely worse than what Socrates was saying in regards to women's rights. But what Aristotle has been saying it contributes to that foundation of what women's rights has historically been, because what Aristotle's notions are is they have historically been a justification for discrimination that has sustained itself for centuries. And this justification states that there's a determined natural order, and a part of being that in that natural order is women being submissive. So still on the topic of ancients, and this is my last part in ancient philosophy, is in the part of Judeo-Christian traditions. So in the book, if you're familiar with Judeo-Christian traditions, you may know that gender is discussed in a particular type of way. And from the very beginning, it's discussed. So in the book of Genesis, I apologize, as the first woman that appears is made from a man. The specific quote is, God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept, and took one of his ribs, and closed it up, and placed it with flesh. And that rib that Lord God has taken from the man, he made into a woman. She's created as a partner to Adam, this woman, Eve, but also becomes a figure of sin as she's successfully convinced by the serpent to eat the forbidden fruit. As she engaged this activity, she asked Adam to try the fruit as well, and he did. And as a result of their actions, God became livid from their sin, and they were both exiled from the Garden of Eden. And why is this significant? Not just because this is in one of the most important books written through history, but it's because of the way it influenced history, just like Aristotle and just like Socrates and Plato, the way he wrote about Socrates, is that throughout history, despite Adam willfully partaking in eating of this fruit, Eve's sin has more emphasis than Adam's. And the story of Adam and Eve has historically been used to justify the oppression and mistreatment of women, as they are seen as kind of a temptress to sin. And even as you go throughout the Bible, later in the Bible, in Timothy 2, one of the quotes is, I permit no women to teach or have authority over a man. She's to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. So thank you guys for listening to a bit of that ancient philosophy. And it starts to change, of course, because we're more in modern times, but also the way people think change. And it kind of goes more towards a positive aspect in women's rights. Not all the way, but just a bit more positive. So as we get more to the future, I would like to jump to John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill wrote in The Subjugation of Women. Well, around the 19th century, to give more context, the predominant ideology was that men and women had innate differences in their nature, kind of like how Aristotle discussed and other numerous individuals discussed. But John Stuart Mill argues that there's no way anyone can know the nature of any sex. And this is because men and women have only been presented in a relation to how they have been in society rather than their actual nature. He says that historically, women, sorry about that, I almost read the same thing. He was kind of saying that for many, this oppression has stunted a part of their societal development. Men who may be unable to reflect on their oppression contribute to it. Mill states, in his opinion, that men base their analysis on what they already know, and history is not reflected upon properly in this aspect. Mill says that some men believe that they understand women because they had relationships with them. But even if men have learned women in this way, it is only one part of their whole nature. Women have not, one of the questions that Mill posed is, why haven't women offered more testimony? And another part of his reasoning for this is that women have been oppressed in society. And this kind of reflected a wider whole of society, as Mill states that men who write things that are disagreeable are still heard. And he uses, to state this point again, that is impossible to know with the way that society currently is, to determine the natural nature of men and women, and to understand the nature of women to some degree must be told by women themselves. So going into a woman who did start to say it for herself, we would have to go a bit more into the future, which is the 20th century, and speaking a bit on Simone de Beauvoir. So she believed that equality was central in human life. When she, a part of the second sex and women as other, she explores what it means to be a woman. And she asks this question: do women even exist? And what is their place? She says that when these questions are usually asked, it's answered, but with vague statements. In the perspective of people who are usually not women, she specifically uses the term, the vocabulary of seers. And she says, if being a female is not enough to say that you're a woman, then we cannot explain what it means to be feminine. And then we still have this question, what does it mean to be a woman? And before she gets to the specific answer of that, she kind of talks about, well, what is men seen as? And men, they're seen when they describe themselves and when they describe their nature, and this is at the time, it's something that's positive and neutral. And in contrast, women represent the negative. And she says that this specific determination of sex ignores certain things. The characteristics of women are seen as a limitation on their nature. And this notion simultaneously ignores the fact that men have certain characteristics as well that may not be as good. Men see their own bodies as normal and women's body as separate to what is normal. So as she goes to answer her own question, she says this: women are women because she can be free and autonomous, but she lives in a society where she has taken the status as the other. So thank you guys for being a bit patient on that. This was the foundation that I saw that actually kind of appeared when I was going through certain American Supreme Court cases. So what is meant by sexual equality? And I'll try to go through this quickly. So in the discussion of the philosophy behind sexual equality, there must be some kind of definition that we can form to direct ourselves in what does that mean? So a reflection of this question, what is sexual equality, the way I'm presenting it, will be in the progression of American legal precedents and argumentation regarding sexual equality. So the first aspect of legal thought that I want to explore was in Bradwell versus the state of Illinois in 1873. So the sex discrimination cases often went by these traditional standards. So in this case, the Supreme Court was arguing the decision made by the Illinois Supreme Court, in which Maya Bradwell was denied a license to practice the law because she was a woman. The majority sided with the Illinois Supreme Court, and only one Chief Justice dissented against this matter. And the argument used to uphold this discrimination against women was used by Justice Bradley's concurrence. This argument said that females are not fit to work in certain occupations and be in certain spaces because this is divine ordinance. And you can kind of connect these to what has been discussed with Aristotle and what has been discussed in biblical texts. The part of Justice Bradley's argument that is in logical concurrence with Aristotle is the idea that by nature, women are timid, delicate, and unfit. And this leaves women in a permanent state of inequality, as the argument in nature can be seen as irrefutable. And then when Justice Bradley uses the term divine ordinance, it is in reference to biblical readings like Timothy, as I mentioned earlier, that forbid women to take positions of power as Adam was created before Eve. And unfortunately, Bradwell versus Illinois set a precedent to justify sex discrimination through the law throughout numerous other cases in the future, in 1875 with Meyer versus Haberset, and in also 1908 with Muller versus Oregon in terms of work hours, and then also in terms of voting rights. So I know I'm running a bit out of time, so I'll actually go a bit to the end. I did have a couple more court cases, but I want to make sure that I'm respectful of your time. So my final thought is kind of understanding these cases in a philosophical sense, realizes equality is not simply something that's on paper. Sexual equality is expanding the definition legally in philosophy. This is because it has to be. As shown by the progression of cases, while one solution is created to prevent blockades in the rights of women, such as adding concepts like being similarly situated or having exceedingly persuasive justification, the depth of women's treatment in society is in constant ratification. As John Stuart Mill discusses in The Subjugation of Women, only society that has perfect equality can determine what is natural or not. Without this equality, we have what we have to this day, which is assumptions that are made based on preconceived notions of who women are, and what role should they take in society. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Ashley. Very interesting. And I have questions, and I'm sure other people do also, but I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for our next presenter. So let's move right on, and then maybe we'll have a few minutes at the end. But Trisha, Mehta, if you are ready, on you go.
I am just going to share my screen. Oh boy, okay. So we're just gonna... Oh my God. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay. Can everyone see that fully? Yes? Okay. So my name is Trisha Mehta, and I'm a sophomore at Ramapo College of New Jersey, and I major in biology. My presentation is titled The Monster That Is a Man, a feminist view of William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing and A Midsummer Night's Dream. How many of you have ever thought that feminism could exist in 16th century literature? We've all read Shakespeare at some point in our lives, but most of us only know about his tragedies or poems. My presentation explores the feminist aspects hidden within Shakespeare's comedies. The actions and dialogue of the female characters within his comedies, specifically Much Ado About Nothing and A Midsummer Night's Dream, show how the plays provide direct and discrete parallels with the feminist theories of the 21st century. Visuals from manga versions of both novels and significant quotes are included to help you follow along. The full paper is available for reference in the 2020 edition of the NRHC student journal, Illuminate. To provide a little background on the plays, William Shakespeare's comedies are usually stories of humorous misunderstandings that result in multiple marriages. The storyline of Much Ado About Nothing follows a young woman named Beatrice and her acclaimed rival, Signor Benedict, in Messina, Italy, who begin the play by quarreling but fall in love by the last act. Along the way, they help unveil a plot to dishonor and shame Beatrice's cousin Hero in order to prevent her marriage to Count Claudio, a close acquaintance of the prince. Similarly, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, two young couples consisting of the main heroine of the play, Hermia, and her beloved Lysander, as well as her best friend Helena and her unrequited love Demetrius, are trapped in a love quadrangle. The four lovers become victims of Fairy King Oberon's love games until a spell causes Demetrius to love Helena, and the two marriages are finally approved. The initial appearance of these plays is that they end in a Disney-like happily ever after. Realistically, the development of all relationships mentioned above is centered around the manipulation and abuse of the female protagonists involved. English women in the 1500s were highly dependent on men. Socially known as the inferior gender, women were expected to obediently perform the duties of a housewife and mother, and were restricted from doing anything more without the permission of a male authority. These social normalities have led British Queen Elizabeth Tudor I to stand out as a symbol of feminist power. Known as the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth's refusal towards marriage and motherhood, as well as her independent position and authority, provided a direct display of a woman's true potential and effectively proved that dependence on a man is not vital to survival. So why is this important? Further examination of these ideas is important because they represent a woman's struggle to find a voice and speak truth to power against currently sexist societal biases, expectations, and stereotypes. These two plays expose the struggle of women in 16th century in ways that are relatable to contemporary women. And that is what the image on the screen represents. The use of symbolism through the characters' words and actions, as well as the metaphorical verbiage used throughout the plays Much Ado About Nothing and A Midsummer Night's Dream, suggest and promote feminist views and values that are certainly ahead of their time. So now looking at part 1, A Woman's Right. Marriage in 16th century England was not as consentful and joyous for women as it is today. They were instead often arranged by relatives, and the bride was allowed little to no say. Even after marriage, women were considered to be under the complete legal ownership of their husbands. These issues regarding sexist and unfair practices towards women's safety and economic power are addressed by our heroine Hermia in A Midsummer Night's Dream. The play begins when Hermia's father and the Duke of Athens try to threaten her into a marriage with Demetrius. In response, Hermia publicly denounces her father's wishes, as seen by the quote on screen. Hermia's flippant tone in her response and the way she addresses acceptance over her death before her refusal to marry indicates her defiance against a forced marriage. This is further enforced by her choice to run to the forest with her desired husband Lysander to escape her father's death threat. Hermia's handling of the men around her show her intelligence as a woman and her ability to handle threatening situations, thus putting her in a higher position of power and control than a man. A modern-day example of a woman reclaiming her power is demonstrated on screen through the song WAP, which I'm sure all of you have heard and seen on TikTok. The plays also promote feminism by including demonstrations of disrespect towards powerful males by women. In the 16th century, women were expected to adjust their lives and themselves in order to please men. This idea is rejected by Much Ado, which suggests that women should be allowed to speak their minds, be themselves, and have their own opinions. Beatrice chooses to openly state her opinions while insulting the men whom she does not like, going so far as to say that Benedict is the prince's jester, a very dull fool. She accuses Benedict of being a homosexual to his face and describes him as the lapdog and laughingstock for other men, thus effectively insulting his manhood and his pride as a well-renowned soldier. Let me clarify that an accusation of homosexuality during this time period was an insult, as it was considered sodomy, often punishable by death, to be gay. This statement is not in any way intended as anti-LGBTQ+. Beatrice also continues to dramatically and openly inform her uncle about her desire to remain unmarried. By openly stating her opinions about marriage to her uncle Leonato, Beatrice denounces the movement towards satisfying men's psychological needs and proves that her opinion as a woman matters just as much as that of a man. Marriage is a fine institution, but one that Beatrice is not ready for. In addition to the defiance of marriage and disrespect of males, comes the play's promotion of the complete rejection of men. The patriarchal society of the late 1500s expected all decisions to be made by men, as women were thought as unable to make emotionally stable decisions. Queen Titania of the fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream reveals the control she has over her own mind and body when she refuses to give up her Indian boy, firmly stating that the boy was given to her and therefore belongs to her, not him. By doing so, Titania does not let Oberon take control of her and her decisions, thus not allowing his claims to be her lord and she his lady interfere in her decision and, therefore, degrading the ideological affirmations of male supremacy. Part 2, Why Women Stay Silent. So, our plays have now established that a woman should be able to freely speak her mind and can make her own independent decisions without the help of a man. Our new question, then, is that if women are capable of having their thoughts and voicing them, why don't they do so? Well, let's look at Hero and Much Ado. In the play, Count Claudio and the prince are angered by an accusation that Hero has lost her virginity prior to marriage. Believing said accusation, they wait until they all meet at the altar to accuse Hero of savage sensuality. Claudio's public accusation barely allows for Hero to defend herself, as seen on screen. After shaming her, the two men leave her to die. Even her father, Leonardo, would rather have her dead than shamed. Because a man was angered, Hero is wrongly labeled as guilty, and her word is taken with so little value that even her own father does not believe her. By having Hero defiled this way, Much Ado suggests that even if a woman did speak her mind, she was not taken seriously, and was still shamed to help cure a man's wounded ego. Continuing to use the example of Hero, we are shown how the idea of virginity is used by men to control women. Virginity symbolizes the innocence and honor that a woman holds. In 16th century England, premarital loss of virginity was considered a sin. Hero is unfairly accused of losing her virginity to another man prior to her marriage to Claudio. Claudio, who becomes enraged at this, demands that Hero reveals with whom these atrocities were committed, stating that only she can clear her name. Even after she states the allegations are false, he refuses to hear her side of the story and to marry her, instead choosing to latch on to a shadow of a doubt. While Claudio's feelings in this case may be understandable, considering both the time period and how any other significant other may feel in such a situation, it is unforgivable for Hero's father to wish death upon his daughter after hearing such an unconfirmed rumor. These views and attitudes of the men in the play towards women demonstrate how important it was for women to protect their virginity, and with that, their self-honor and self-respect in the 16th century. You can see this on the beautiful graphics on the screen. So going on to part 3, society's double standard for gender. This discussion on virginity now leads us to an open discussion on society's double standard for gender. This is further explored through Beatrice in Much Ado. In the play, Beatrice openly insults Benedict, resulting in a scolding by the prince. Yet Benedict himself speaks ill of Hero by insulting her beauty, and neither the prince nor Count Claudio attempts to chastise him for it. And this is seen on the visuals on the screen. You can see what they're specifically saying circled in red. As seen, Claudio nor the prince scold Benedict for his insults towards Hero, but Beatrice is scolded by the prince towards her for hers towards Benedict. And we'll go back. Okay. Although the character of Beatrice could easily be likened to modern women in that she speaks her mind, there still remains in this play the double standard for men and women, as seen in the emphasis put on how Beatrice cannot insult a man, but Benedict can freely and openly insult a woman. This inequality between the way men and women are treated for the same actions is the double standard in society for gender. Another hypocritical situation is also seen in Midsummer Night with Helena and Demetrius. Demetrius chastises Helena for chasing after him into the forest and tells her by insulting her modesty and honor as a woman. But while he suggestively threatens Helena, he also simultaneously chases after Hermia. He chastises Helena for doing exactly what he's doing, effectively showing the hypocrisy of the double standard for gender. And this is seen with the quote written on screen. So, how did women deal with all of this emotional abuse and societal oppression when realistically they really had no power? Women developed ways to fight back by manipulating societal laws and expectations in favor of themselves. One example of this is Beatrice's manipulation of Benedict in Much Ado. Beatrice promises Benedict her love in exchange for Claudio's murder. By doing so, she tricks Benedict into getting revenge for Hero, manipulating his feelings in order to fulfill her own desires. Hermia also shows her wits in A Midsummer Night's Dream when she avoids sleeping with Lysander in the forest by hinting that it may lead to a loss of her virginity, honor, and virtue. By telling her beloved that it is for her sake, Hermia takes advantage of the fact that two men are fighting for her and compromises Lysander's desires by subtly threatening to leave him in order to keep herself safe. So now, seeing how the women of these two plays have been treated and the measures that they have taken to ensure their safety, both plays expose the true plight of 16th century women. One validation of this is the main plot of Much Ado, which includes tricking and manipulating Beatrice into falling in love with and marrying Benedict. Beatrice's claims of not wanting to get married are entirely ignored by Leonardo, Claudio, and the prince, who in discussion claim that she were an excellent wife for Benedict, quote unquote. Beatrice's, I'm so sorry, I lost my place. In addition to this, Hero's reputation as an honorable woman is fully restored only when Claudio re-agrees to marry her, revealing that Hero's doubleness does not signify her duplicity, but rather the violence of the patriarchal culture's construction of women as duplicitous, which makes it necessary for Hero to experience a symbolic death in order to reclaim her reputation as a maiden. In other words, basically, society believes that women are replaceable. This idea of a woman's plight is further examined in Midsummer Night. The happy ending of the play masks the sexist truth. Hermia is only allowed to marry Lysander because Theseus eventually allows it, showing that aesthetic harmony achieved in comedic knitting together of the plots at the end of Act 4 is tinged with the ideology of male supremacy. And this is represented by the apple on screen, which looks amazing and delicious on the outside, but when you open it, it's actually rotted on the inside. So in conclusion, William Shakespeare's two plays have managed to do what could be considered the seemingly impossible. Both plays have exposed the struggles of a woman in 16th century in a way that is both understandable and relatable. The pain that women in Much Ado About Nothing and A Midsummer Night's Dream feel, and the abuse and constant threat of harm that they are forced to undergo, reflects that of women today in the 21st century. Women today are still criticized for not keeping their virginity and remaining pure before marriage, are scared to walk alone in public for fear of being attacked and violated, as has very much been seen lately on social media, and many are still manipulated into making badly influenced decisions, like Beatrice and Titania. However, there are also many women who stand up for what they believe in, regardless of the consequences, like Hermia. It is the everlasting continuance of this issue that shows that a woman's struggle for freedom for men is truly timeless. And these are my 3 slides of references. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Okay, so it is 10:15. We can hang out for an extra minute if anybody has any quick questions, but also if everybody is ready to move on to our next meetings and other presentations, feel free. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and thank you for your presentations. So really quickly, I can hang out in the room for a couple minutes if any of the presenters have questions or anything. Let's do that now.
And for Ashley, actually. So I also read Plato's The Republic because I did a piece on utopian literature for my thesis. And I was wondering what you thought about his idea that the ideal society is run by philosopher kings, and that there are some people who are meant to rule and some who are not, in light of like what he says about equality between the sexes, but not like equality between station.
Well, of course, like that's one of the most like interesting things when you think about what he said in the Republic. My like personal opinion on that, you know, is it's not something I necessarily think would be effective. I think we kind of have versions of that, like in modern society, where you do have like certain groups of individuals that are just ruling. I mean, let me try to think of an example. In some socialist governments, I believe that there may be a small group of individuals who kind of exert that force politically and socially. And while it's an interesting thought, you know, if people weren't flawed, you know, it would work, but it doesn't. And in the context of gender equity, I think it would definitely be something that, you know, is made worse, because you had someone who is saying this. You had Socrates who's discussing this in detail, and he even despite saying, okay, maybe these are things that can happen, you know, maybe women can have a similar education or same education or some same rights, there's still that idea of inherent inferiority that, you know, he clearly believes in. So it's just the problem with that is that it's just as limited as people are, which will make it just, no matter what form it comes in, inherently limited. Thank you. I know I rambled a bit, but that was just all my first thoughts on that.
Okay, any other questions?
I just want to say to everyone, nice job on your presentations. If you want to come to my recycling one, I am at 10:30 in the problem of plastic tab. But I learned a lot. I did not know a lot about all this stuff, but I'm happy I came and I learned about it. Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. I think that is a lovely wrap up right there. They were very informative, very interesting. I learned a lot also. Thank you, everybody. I hope to see other people at other meetings and presentations throughout the weekend. And I guess we'll call it. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Enjoy
Thank
the
you.
conference.
Thank you. You as well.